Good evening. My name is Mohammed Noor, a senior at Bowdoin College, and on behalf of the Bowdoin Public Service Initiative, and with the generous support of the Donald M. Zirkut Fund, I would like to warmly welcome you to this evening's discussion. I am deeply honored to welcome not one, but two incredible people to our stage this evening. In a moment, I will introduce you to Katie Benner, Bowdoin class of 1999, who will in turn introduce you to Mr. McDonough and begin this evening's discussion. But first, I'd like to share a bit of context for their conversation. A year ago, Bowdoin launched a new initiative aimed to help students from all academic disciplines explore real aspects of how to serve the common good through government and public service. Through educational seminars, immersion trips, and funded internship support, sophomore and junior participants studied public policy and then saw firsthand how it applied at the federal level in Washington, D.C. In addition to these small cohort experiences, this initiative also hosts on-campus events, such as this one, to challenge all of us to think intentionally about the ways we might apply our own education and skills in service for the common good. Through the stories of renowned alumni such as Ambassador Thomas Pickering, Secretary William Cohen, Senator George Mitchell, and former Assistant Secretary of State Susan Thornton, and extended community members like Mr. McDonough, we can gain a broader understanding of how we as students might contribute to the forward motion of our democratic society. I was fortunate to be selected as a member of the inaugural cohort of the Bowdoin Public Service Fellows. During my 10-week fellowship with the Embassy of Somalia in Washington, D.C., I served as the main line of communication between the counselor and other diplomatic officials from USAID, World Bank, and the State Department, and drafted monthly meeting and development reports for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As I reflect on my summer at the embassy and in DC, I am grateful to have had an experience that pushed me intellectually, challenged me substantially, and inspired me thoroughly. I am more confident in my commitment towards public service, and I'm excited to see the future of this initiative. For sophomores and juniors out there tonight who might be interested, plan to come out to one of the informational sessions taking place in the next few weeks to learn more about applying for the 2019 cohort. This evening's discussion on a life in public service will be hosted by our own Katie Benner, who we're thrilled to have back on campus. A native of Vermont, Katie majored in English at Bowdoin. In a recent conversation, she said that she counts David Collings and Trisha Welsh as formative influences of her early love of writing and film, and credits Ann Kibbe for, as she says, brainwashing her into loving Milton and poetry. Since her time at Bowdoin, Katie has worked as a reporter for Fortune magazine, where she covered financial markets, private equity and hedge funds, and at Bloomberg, where she was a tech columnist. In 2015, she joined the New York Times in their San Francisco bureau, covering Apple, venture capital, and startups. Last year, Katie was part of the team of reporters who received the Pulitzer-prize for public service for the reporting on workplace sexual harassment issues in the Silicon Valley. In January of this year, Katie moved to DC, where she now covers for the Department of Justice. So please join me in welcoming Katie Benner and Denis McDonough to Bowdoin.
Well, thank you so much, all of you, for joining us this evening to celebrate Bowdoin's Public Service Initiative and to learn more about the rewards and challenges of serving the common good through government and public service. So before we begin the conversation, I want to offer a warm and sincere thank you to Clayton Rose, the president of Bowdoin College, who supports our community as we work to foster a sense of civic duty and a desire to work towards something larger and more important than our personal achievements, and to work toward the common good. I'd like to thank Sarah Chingos, the Associate Director for Public Service at the McKean Center for the Common Good, and to Eli Orlick and Tony Sprague for providing support for this evening and for being such gracious hosts. And of course, thank you to Mo for an incredible and warm introduction. So a huge thanks to all of you who chose to spend your evening with Denis McDonough, President Obama's Chief of Staff, and a formidable national security expert. Denis came to Washington, D.C. by way of Minnesota, where he grew up the ninth of 11 children. After graduating from St. John's University with a degree in history and from Georgetown's Walsh School of Foreign Service, He was a staffer on the House International Relations Committee and a senior staffer for Tom Daschle, Senator Tom Daschle, Senator Ken Salazar, and a young Senator Barack Obama, advising on foreign policy issues. It was Obama's presidential campaign that put Denis on a path to the White House. He was known as the guy who shoveled the driveway of an Iowa couple to get them to caucus for Obama. And at the same time, he served as his campaign's senior foreign policy expert. After the election, he became a key national security advisor and the chair of the National Security Council's Deputies Committee. His duties included addressing issues and challenges related to the Iran nuclear negotiations, understanding the expanding global influence of Russia and China, and managing the Afghanistan surge and the Iraq drawdown. And then, of course, in February 2013, he became Obama's final chief of staff. He managed the 4,000-member White House staff, the cabinet secretaries, the government's agency leaders, and he advised the president on key domestic policy, national security, and management issues. And thanklessly, he coordinated an unprecedented expansion of technology experts and engineers across the federal government, pushing the bureaucracy into the 21st century. So thank you again, Denis, for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Dee. Thank you.
So I mean, we may as well begin with what it was like to be Obama's chief of staff, because if we all recall, Obama went through quite a few chiefs of staff before he before he chose you. I think there were 4. So having seen 4 people cycle through this position, what was the draw for you? You know, what did you think was appealing about this? And then what did you think your greatest challenge would be?
Good question. And let me just start by echoing your thanks to Clayton and Julianne for hosting us, and Sarah for running this wonderful program. Mo for a very generous introduction and remarkable run as one of your leaders here. I also just have to note that I shoveled their lawn. I delivered them pizza. I got them a letter from the former Senate Majority Leader, and they still caucused for Secretary Clinton.
What are you gonna do?
So, the failure number 1. So why did I take this crazy job? Andy Card, who was President Bush 43's first chief of staff, said, "This is not a job you apply for. It comes to you." And that's kind of what happened with me. I was sitting with the president in the Oval in January 2013, and he started talking about it as if this was a job I should do. So I didn't really get a chance to say yes or no. And I like to say that the Oval Office is like the absolute home game for the president. It's disorienting to be in there. You kind of can't tell which way is out. It literally is a circle I think it's designed strategically to disorient our enemies. And so I think had I had my wits about me, I might have said no. I think what I thought my biggest challenge was we had kind of 3 big challenges. 2 were easy. I think 1 was harder. One was our cabinet was not super happy. What happens when you go through a re-election is the White House gets very defensive. So it really pins down and really tries to micromanage cabinet secretaries. That happened in the re-elect in 2012. So we had to make our cabinet happy. Congress was not particularly happy with us, partially because one house was controlled by the opposition, and partially because I think a lot of senators and Congress people thought we didn't spend enough time with it. So we had to make Congress happy. The third thing, which was the most challenging one, is time. The beauty about being reelected is you get reelected. And that gives you an opportunity to become a great president. It's hard to be a great president if you're not reelected. But the challenge is you also know how fast 4 years goes. I was talking about this with Julianne at dinner. 4 years at Bowdoin goes pretty fast, especially if you're a parent. Maybe it doesn't always feel that way to you guys. In the White House, a president feels time go fast. And so a real challenge as the president's chief was to figure out how to prioritize what, how to not let the crises of the day overwhelm his goals for his presidency, and then how to work with an opposition in Congress. And some of those things we got done okay, some of the things we didn't.
What were the challenges? What did you not get done well?
Well, geez.
Or the one that you wish most that you were able to go back and change?
Yeah. Well, look, I'll tell you the one I think about every day is Syria. But my hunch is we'll talk about that later. Like the thing that pains me when I look at our political environment now is the toxicity and the kind of profound separation and distrust across party lines. And some of that has always been the case in Washington, and it's surely been worse than this. I mean, after all, we had a civil war. But look, I wish I could have done more on that. I'm not sure in retrospect what I would have done. But when you come to a place like this and you see the excitement of all these remarkable students and the idealism and the belief in the system, and then you compare that with the cynicism that so often now kind of permeates the city that you cover, and you're trying to understand, it just leads me to conclude that we're not performing at our best. And something is missing between this idealistic idea and this remarkable citizenry and its institutions. So, we could have done like maybe a couple afternoons on that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Because the time goes by very fast,
Yes.
so you don't want to.
You don't want to overinvest.
So I want to jump forward for a moment
Yeah.
because you did talk about some of the toxicity in DC, how difficult it is. And right now I think that we have a White House. We have 3 books that have come out from 3 extremely different authors that all paint a picture of a White House that is incredibly chaotic. So looking at John Kelly, current chief of staff, how would you grade the job that he's doing right now? And what parts of his job look similar to what it was that you did, and what parts of his job look entirely different?
So look, I think, I know John well. I worked with John a lot when he was in Pentagon. He worked both for Secretary Panetta when I was at the National Security Council, and then he worked at the United States Southern Command in Florida when I was in the Chief of Staff's office. So I know him quite well. And I think the distance between expectation and performance is exceedingly large. And so I think it's like a C. And I think that flows specifically from the second part of your question, which is, what are different things that he has to deal with that I didn't? And I think all the chiefs, as I've talked to them, have the same reaction, which is, it's a tough job. He's got the toughest assignment in that tough job, because I think there doesn't seem to be a lot of connectivity between the president's staff and the president. And so I think that makes it very difficult to grade John on the traditional curve, which is, does the White House seem to be executing as against a strategy that has everybody working on the same team? They're executing. They have an argument that they're executing well as against their goals. But they're just running it differently than anybody else has ever run it. And so in that respect, I think John's got an exceedingly difficult job.
So he's going to be a diplomat next, clearly. He's been... Dennis, I think that I don't want to spend too much time on the current administration, but I do want to ask about what's going on with the norms and mores in DC. You also touched upon that a little bit. And we're starting to understand that so much of what we expect from the executive branch is based more on tradition than on law. So for example, the expectation that the president won't interfere in the Justice Department and its investigations, that's a norm. The Justice Department is part of the executive branch. It's under the president, and clearly this president feels like he can reach down. This expectation that the president and his family will not enrich themselves while in office. That's something that people held as sacrosanct, but I don't think that that's the case anymore. And things like the daily press briefing that support public transparency and accountability, we don't see that anymore either. So these traditions that are no longer observed, are we going to see a permanent change in how the president and the American people regard the office of the presidency going forward? Or can we ever return to a sense of what normal behavior was in office that existed before?
Yeah, I don't think we'll go back to what it was. What we go to, I think, is as yet unclear. I do think that several of the norms that you laid out, which is independence of the Justice Department's investigations, independence of the Attorney General on criminal investigative matters, rather than on policy matters where he's he or she is a full member of the policymaking apparatus that meets at the White House, that debates at the White House, that responds to the president's wishes on policy questions. That norm is going to have to come back. And I think it's useful to stop for a second to ask why the norms came up in the first instance. And it's because we have a rule of law in this country that suggests that political consideration does not enter into a criminal investigative matter or a criminal matter generally, because we believe that going back to the purpose of the Declaration of Independence, that the power of the state in political matters should not impact straightforward law enforcement questions. That's going to have to come back. And I think the way that comes back is the way it's always come back. And if you look at the class of 1974 after Watergate, you ended up having a very overwhelming number of new members of Congress, they called them the Watergate generation, that came in and renewed Congress and its practices. And as a result, you end up with things like the Senate and House Intelligence Committee, with the church investigation on intelligence activities, with the Presidential Records Act, all these things, direct responses to the activities around Watergate. Same thing happened in the Year of the Woman in 1992 in reaction to the Clarence Thomas hearings, where all of a sudden, as a result of popular reaction to those hearings and the treatment of a particular witness, Anita Hill, there was overnight many more, still not many, but many more women members of the House and of the Senate. As a result, you see changes in how the Senate operates, how the House operates, and then you saw new laws. Question is, do we see the same change this year, right, in this election? Because I think questions of corruption surely are squarely on the ballot. One last thing. The beauty of the founders is by having these 3 articles in the Constitution and the 3 separate branches and all their assignments, envisioned those branches having to watch each other. None of the powers in any of those articles is self-executing. You need somebody to exercise them. So the norm I'm most concerned about was the norm that made me most angry when I was in the White House, which was congressional oversight. Congress can get up in your business in the White House. And they can get up in your business because the Constitution demands that they do that they oversee what you're doing and they hold you accountable to the voters and to the taxpayers for doing it. The fact that there has been none for a year and a half is an abdication of that responsibility, and that's going to have to come back.
I'm going to ask a foreign policy question and then a couple of domestic policy questions. So please be preparing your questions. There will be microphones set up in the front, and I want to make sure that you all get a chance to ask the much harder questions that I'm going to ask of Dennis and grill him.
Pretty hard, I think.
And also, we love to give priority to Bowdoin students so they can get as much as they can in the evening. Now, speaking of Syria, which you mentioned.
Yep.
Let's go back in time to 2003. As a young Senate aide, you helped put together the resolution that authorized the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And that decision has since been questioned on the left and the right. How did that decision on Iraq influence your decision-making on Syria, in which you were noted as one of the members, one of the White House staffers most opposed to intervening and taking military action?
It's a good question. I mean, so in 2002 and 2003, I was very involved as a Senate staffer in writing both a resolution that authorized the invasion of Afghanistan and then subsequently the invasion of Iraq. And the processes by which we came came to those resolutions and then the results of those invasions, no doubt colored my view of the proper role of each of the branches in how we conduct war. And so if you fast forward, just taking that for granted for a second, to 2013, where the question was, after confirming that the Assad regime used chemical weapons against its own population, whether the United States should use force to extract a cost from the Syrian government. The question we debated vigorously in August and September 2013 was not whether we should do it, that is to say use force, but rather whether we should do it only after getting congressional authorization to do so. I argued strongly that we should have congressional authorization to do so because I do not envision any use of force in Syria at that moment to have been a short or concise effort. I think it was prudent that we plan that it ended up being a drawn-out process, much the way Iraq ended up being a drawn-out process. And I thought we owed it to the country that all of the institutions of the government, Congress and the president, be involved in the decision to put the country on that path. I was buoyed in my view on that by the fact that Congress was also urging us to do this, Republicans and Democrats. In fact, we had a meeting at the White House where all of the elected leaders of the Congress, Republican and Democrat, urged the president to do it and went to the mics afterwards in the north lawn of the White House to say that they supported the president doing it. Interestingly, though, over the course of the next weeks, Congress decided that it would not take up an authorization. And in light of that fact, I did not think it made sense for the president to use force absent congressional support for doing so.
Given the fact that the congressional leaders decided to sort of renege on their support that they had implied that they would give, and given the fact that the relationship with Congress was extraordinarily bad, isn't it fair to interpret the fact that the administration still continued to not use force as an abdication of responsibility for what happened in Syria?
This is a debate I have a lot, as you might suspect. But I start this question by asking a simple, I start this debate by asking a simple question, which is, what is the purpose of the use of force in Syria? The purpose was to get the Syrians to not use chemical weapons again. Even better if they gave up their chemical weapons, or at least acknowledged the existence of them. So, as the result of a very credible threat of the use of military force in Syria, in the fall of 2013, the Syrians acknowledged the existence of chemical weapons for the first time ever. It had one of the biggest chemical weapons programs in the world, but never acknowledged its existence. They not only acknowledged the existence of it, but gave up vast amounts of that program and vast amounts of those weapons to the international organization that oversees the enforcement of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And that all happened without the intervention of the United States, either with boots on the ground or with air power. We now know, painfully, that not all the chemical weapons were given up, since they've been used again. But the question I come back to then is it an abdication of United States leadership or responsibility if the outcome of the president's actions were to dramatically reduce the amount of chemical weapons in Syria, and to do that without exposing Americans to extended combat on the ground? And I think that's not an abdication of American responsibility. In fact, I think that's a profoundly impactful series of policy decisions on behalf of the president.
And then turning to more domestic matters, we're here in Maine. I grew up in Vermont. Northern New England is one of, I think, the greatest places in the country. It is, thank you. It is also a part of the country, like so many others, that has been ravaged by the opioid crisis. On the way over here, you told me that this was a big concern of yours. it was also a crisis that was brewing in Obama's second term. And to people who weren't close to Washington, who were just observers, it did not feel like the Obama administration understood the severity of the crisis, that they had their arms around it at all, nor did they see how it was going to impact the 2016 election. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it looked like inside the White House as this was raging, because people have started to compare the opioid crisis under Obama to the HIV and AIDS crisis under Reagan.
Yeah, so I think it is a massive problem. And we witnessed it becoming a massive problem during our course of time in the administration. And it is true that it was not until, say, 2014, 2015, and 2016 that we began to seek the kinds of dramatic expansions of federal assistance for the states that we witnessed over the course of the second term in the White House. But it is true that it was at that time that we began it. The idea that it was not a major priority in that period is, I think, belied by the dramatic increase in federal investments and support to states. But importantly, it also goes to the heart of the reason why expansion of Medicaid as a key piece of the Affordable Care Act was so important. Because what you see happening, or what we witnessed happen across the country, particularly here in the Northeast, but also in my home state of Minnesota, was lack of access to mental health treatment and substance abuse treatment because people didn't have health care coverage. And so one of the things we're seeing now as we witness a kind of a swing on the politics on the Affordable Care Act is that states that heretofore had not expanded Medicaid are expanding, Indiana being a classic example, another state ravaged by addiction and substance abuse. But also an effort now by those states that have expanded Medicaid using the opioid crisis as a principal reason to oppose efforts to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. So I think it's very difficult to disentangle the opioid reaction from the administration from the ongoing debate on the Affordable Care Act. And there's not an issue on which I spent more time as Chief of Staff than the defense of the Affordable Care Act. And I would do that again every day and then some if we were back there, if for no other reason than the opioid crisis.
What would you have done different on messaging around the Affordable Care Act so people understood that it had real world implications for an issue that was close to home and not a piece of policy? Because the Affordable Care Act is important to you is not something that gets people out to the polls. I care about the fact that your cousin's dying of opioids does. So What was wrong in the messaging?
Well, I think what was wrong in the messaging is that what we needed to do was prove facts. You've witnessed this more than any of us probably, which is skepticism about what public officials say, cynicism about promises and commitments. And especially in a context of a public debate where, for example, we had the whole summer of 2010 a debate around whether a central tenet of the Affordable Care Act was the establishment of death panels for treatment of elderly Americans, which is entirely a fact made up of whole cloth, is evidence of that fact. So what we perhaps didn't account for is the lag between execution and, as a result, then people recognizing what it actually meant for them, and the public debate that increased the cynicism. And that's why we find ourselves where we are today, which is people recognizing that expanded Medicaid means better access to mental health care. It means better access to treatment facilities. We've all had this, friends and family who can't find a bed for someone in their family who's experiencing critical addiction. The Affordable Care Act has helped expanded access to such beds as a result. And I don't know that we could have made that argument, Katie, in 2010 and 2011 in a way that people would find it believable.
They needed to see the tragedy, is what you're trying to say.
No, I think they needed not to see the tragedy. People needed to see that the Affordable Care Act itself meant access for them that they didn't have. And without proving that on the ground concretely, I don't think we could make that argument in a way that people would believe.
And this is my last question before everybody will race up to their microphones and start shooting questions at Dennis. But this is a little bit more personal. I know that you grew up in a Catholic family. You have brothers who've joined the priesthood, and we also know that throughout American history, faith and religion have guided and supported some of the country's most progressive movements, including the civil rights movement. Religious leaders were once strongly aligned with the progressive left, and now it feels like the Democratic Party has abandoned people of faith as a group, especially as their interests seem on the surface at odds with progressive values like support for LGBTQ and trans rights. So how important is it for Democrats to reconnect with people of faith in America? Can the party do that while navigating a split between more traditional Democrats and the more radical wing led by candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? And can you have a party that succeeds in America that abdicates religious life as a tenet?
Yeah, I think the answer to your last part of the question, which is can a party be successful without having faith as a central tenet? Can such a party exist or thrive? And I think the answer to that is no. And I think that this is an example where Democrats have been reluctant to talk about one of the central motivations for many of them to get into public life. I think a classic example of this is the Democratic leader in the House, Nancy Pelosi. There's no more faithful Catholic in either chamber than Mrs. Pelosi. And this is a widely underknown, underreported fact. This is also a question where we've also allowed, as a public matter, faith in public life to be defined on a very narrow set of issues, which is to say, the common good somehow gets defined down to questions around choice or life and doesn't include questions of tolerance and openness, tolerance of many tenets of the Sermon on the Mount, which go to the Beatitudes, which is what led me and my family and my parents to push us into lives of public service. And so we shouldn't be shy about being people of faith. We shouldn't be shy about saying that the things we believe, to include on LGBTQ, are views and visions based in our reading of the gospel. And we shouldn't be shy about recognizing, as the candidate you mentioned, or Bernie Sanders, or anybody else espousing single-payer health, that part of the reason to do that is because we believe every person is a person of dignity and deserves access to health care in this country. Anybody who's suffering from substance abuse disorder deserves access to mental health treatment. And when we have a more efficient healthcare system, that allows us to do that. And that's fundamentally, in my tradition, a religious view. And we shouldn't be shy about that. I'm not, anyway.
So questions from the audience. I don't see anybody at a microphone. Oh, we have one here? Sure, please, come on up.
Hi, my name's Killian McDonough.
Good to see you, cousin.
Same last name, yes. And so I know you came from an Irish background, so my question is, how has your Irish heritage played a role in being chief of staff at the White House?
Well, it helped working for such an Irish president. So, I don't know, he tried to break out the apostrophe only one day a year. I was like, I'm for that all the time, man. Look, this goes to the last question that Katie answered. I have 4 grandparents who arrived in this country because they couldn't stay where they were. And they came here, my grandpa was a Marine, because there's nowhere else to go. And I think they, like so many other Irish, but also so many other Salvadorans and Somalis and Bangladeshis and Indians, have contributed hugely to this country. So it's being from an Irish family, an immigrant family, and a family with a lot of brothers and sisters, leads me to conclude that diversity has, as the Supreme Court itself ruled in the University of Michigan case, a value and a virtue all its own. And that was the Rehnquist court, by the way, that concluded diversity has a value all its own. That the openness that this country has traditionally shown is not a manifestation of weakness, as some people argue today, but rather is a fountain of our strength. And it also underscores to me that I can be, and I'm celebrated to be both very proud of my Irish heritage, but also a very patriotic American. And I think that's as true for anybody who comes to this country, because it turns out we, an overwhelming majority, all did come from somewhere else. So those are the 3 things I'd say. Unfortunately, I don't have any good, I'm not a good musician, I'm not a good writer. I love reading Colm McCann and Seamus Heaney, but I can't write or sing like any of the good Irishmen.
All right, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hello. Thank you both for coming to Bowdoin. My question is about the way in which technology and machine learning is affecting our economy. To what extent do you think that a universal basic income would be a good policy to combat the more negative effects of automation?
Great.
Excellent question. It's really interesting to think, this question could just as well be answered by Katie, I think, and probably more effectively. But right now, Washington is doing what Washington does when there's a big problem, kind of like opioids, which is there's a debate about how big the problem is, rather than a real debate about, okay, irrespective of how big the problem is, what should we do about it? And so my first reaction to your question is, if, let's say, McKinsey is right, which is probably on the low end of the estimates, but McKinsey says 60% of the tasks performed by 30% of the professions we currently acknowledge on the globe will be replaced by machines. So 60% of the tasks and 30% of the jobs. That sounds relatively low, but that's still, and it's lower than many of the more dystopian analyses. That's pretty large. So point number 2 is we should be thinking about big changes like UBI. The idea being that everybody gets basically a guaranteed income from the state if they're not sufficient paying jobs for everybody. Third point, although I think we should be testing those things out, and I think there's really interesting papers out there about this, and the Finns and the Swiss have tried a couple of experiments on it, I don't think it's going to work in this country. Especially when you look at even the components of the basic guarantees right now, the social safety net, are being pulled back. It's very difficult in your state to even get expanded Medicaid, even when an overwhelming majority of the population votes for it. So I worry that we might overshoot the runway if you look only at these big fixes. And I think rather we should be looking at some interesting things that I know President Rose and others are, and your trustees and your professors are talking about in the curriculum here, which is what are the skills and capabilities that you guys should have in 10 years to be able to compete in this economy. Also, what about the non-college educated people? What are the opportunities they're going to get? So yeah, yes to UBI. Let's see if it works, if there's something that works, but let's not leave other things on the table, which might be more doable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, go ahead, please.
Hi, Ms. Bender, Mr. McDonough. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Andrew Welch McNeil. I'm a senior here. My question gets at that, I think it was the second question about sort of the breakdown of precedent. One of the things that I get most frustrated by when watching or reading the news is sort of the feeling that the two sides are playing by a different set of rules. And the Supreme Court nomination is kind of Exhibit A. Like watching what's going on now, like I almost want the Democrats to sort of play dirty, so to speak, in the manner that that Mitch McConnell did with Merrick Garland. And so, you know, obviously that's a bad tendency because it has to stop somewhere or else everything just sort of collapses. I don't know. Yeah. Can you speak to that? How can a party be successful when their opponent is, you know, playing dirty?
Yeah. Like it's a frustration I have sometimes when I read the paper too. It's in Syria too. I remember I was talking to a member of Congress on the phone in September of 2013, and he said, look, we want you to go ahead and use force in Syria. I said, yes, I know you do. You're telling me. And he said, and we support you. I said, yes, and normally when you support something, you go vote on it. And he said, well, we'll send you a letter, we'll do anything. I said, how about this? How about you vote on it? Because that's what you do, right? And he said, well, by the way, what we're looking for is precise, limited, decisive action. And I said, okay, let's go through those: precise, limited, and decisive. Okay, tactical nuke? Is that what we're talking about here? So, believe me, I feel the frustration. And my heart breaks for Merrick Garland, who is an unbelievably decent man and a very judicious person, who I think is an excellent appeals court judge and would be a great Supreme Court justice. Nevertheless, for the reason that I said to Katie, which is these norms are self-executing and the powers are self-executing. And the oath we give to hold up the Constitution, but also I believe the responsibilities in the Constitution, not just the words, but the spirit of the Constitution, I wouldn't do differently what we did, which is, and I get this all the time, which is you guys are such a bunch of wimps. But you know what? This whole thing is an experiment, and how we play the game is as important as the outcome. And I'm a win-loss guy, I get that. I keep score on everything, including with my kids, and they still beat me. But how you play the game is as important as the outcome, in my view. And we owe that to the country, and that's what we believe. We believe in the institution. We're institutionalists. So, in the main, that's worked for us, by the way. And it's worked for us longer than any other country on the history of the planet. And it's worked in a way that I think we can be proud of. But it's not easy, and this is one of those times. So we just got to fight it through it.
Also, a quick follow-up on that.
Yeah.
You know, Obama relied very heavily on Article 2 of the Constitution,
Yes,
on
he did.
executive power, in order to push through DACA, environmental initiatives,
Yes.
to some extent the ACA, a lot of his key policy choices. And now we're seeing that be dismantled because it wasn't enshrined by legislation. So is it possible for a president to have a lasting impact if his party or her party does not also control the legislature? Do we now need both? Are we in an era where, because of this incivility, we can no longer have an executive branch that makes choices without this full support of the legislature?
I think that I'd say three things to that. One is executive action, especially executive action to include, I think we'll see this borne out, particularly on the Clean Power Plan and some of the environmental regulations, I think is not being entirely reported accurately, which is to say, President Trump has started a process to stop the executive action that the President Obama put in place by rulemaking, but it hasn't stopped it yet. And the economy continues to go that way. And so, one, the story is untold yet. There's no doubt he wants to change it. The question is, can the institutions change before he fully changes it? Because time matters. Two is, there's no doubt that the best way to protect a president, an action is to enshrine it in law. But that's no guarantee either. And ultimately, the principal check is whether when these changes come, for example, a change on the Affordable Care Act is pulling off the charts right now. Democrats, rather than running from it, are running on it. And it could be that healthcare and corruption are the issues that define this year's midterm elections. If that's the case, then you'll see efforts that President Obama took defended by the institutions. Thirdly, a big piece of legislation or a big action like the Clean Power Plan or a big piece of statute like the Affordable Care Act, those things are routinely tinkered with and fixed. Civil Rights Act, monumental piece of legislation, still is amended on a pretty regular basis. Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid. We've added Part D now to Medicare. We started with Medicare. We've added Parts A, B, C, and D. So what's different is a belief that there's kind of a winner-take-all swipe, that any particular move that's the end of the day. That was never President Obama's view. You heard him say last week, I have a view, which is better is good. And by the way, the Constitution envisions better, right? It's in order to create a more perfect union. It's a belief that it's never done. So somebody's going to have to take a step to make it better. It could be that somebody takes a step to make it worse, which is what we're in. But the idea that there's some knockout punch is a mistake. And it was a mistake for us to think that there was knockout punches, and it'll be a mistake for President Trump to think that there's any knockout punches, because there's not.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Loy. I'm a junior here. So I grew up in a State Department family and really enjoyed my upbringing. But recently, especially with the current administration, a lot of our State Department friends who are still there have shown increasing frustration. And I was wondering if you have any words of advice for those of us interested going into public service.
Yeah, Uncle Sam needs you. Badly. I've had this conversation with my State Department friends, with a lot of the White House career staff. When I left, I run into them on the street. And I thank everybody who stays. And I urge people who stayed to stay. And if John Kelly, notwithstanding my giving him a C, were to call me tomorrow for the first time in his tenure, I would urge him to stay. This government only works because of people like you and people like Katie. It's the government of the people. And it's hard. There's sometimes, and there are a lot of people who disagreed with us, by the way, civil servants. And we'd have been weaker had they left. And the policies would have been weaker. And so we need public servants like you. I guarantee you, I mean, this, we were talking about this earlier, I mean, this list of public servants from Bowdoin is unbelievable. If you just produced George Mitchell, that would be one, right? But Susan Thornton, Tom Pickering, you know, and those are just today, all right? Today's leaders. If you go back over the course of time, this list is unbelievable. Speakers of the House, Justice of the Supreme Court. As I said to the class earlier today, the government class, you guys are basically halfway there. You're kind of like, you got to do it now. Add on top of that the fact that we really need you, and we need you now more than ever. Because not only do we have challenges at home, but the world is a very dynamic place in a way that's not been true since I entered public life, 1996.
We have time for 3 more questions, so why don't we go here?
Yeah, so I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the opioid crisis.
Yes.
Obviously in Maine, we have a governor who's pretty reticent, to put it lightly, to expand Medicaid, but there are thousands of people dying every year, and death rates rising in states that, like Vermont, that have expanded Medicaid pretty quickly and do have fairly progressive policies on the opioid crisis. And a lot of that's because even when people do have health care, it only provides 3 weeks in a treatment facility. And there's a lot of data that people need more time to get over this.
Yes.
So what does the healthcare system look like that provides 6 months, 9 months in these places? Was that something you were talking about while you're in the White House? And how is that politically feasible when everything that we've been talking about today currently exists?
Yeah. So I think that, I think this is playing out right now in this debate that you're covering, which is a question of states that want to provide safe injection sites and whether the federal government will sanction those states in some way, where the science overwhelmingly suggests that overdoses are much lower in places where safe injection sites are made available. And so what does the healthcare system look like? It's got to be one that allows preventive care to be given much more cheaply than it is. And I think we're making good progress on, which would mean more regular access. And basically 5 years of data from our time in the government and countless economic studies and analyses from other countries show that early access, preventive access, over time is much cheaper than only chronic access to healthcare facilities. So I think the answer of what it looks like is fairly straightforward, which is we have to have more people covered with better access and more regular access. The big question on that is initial cost, and all we can do there is keep fighting. And I think what interesting thing about this debate right now and this campaign right now is we're going to have that debate again, it looks like. And not just because Democrats elected at the federal level, but also Republicans in state houses across the country. Not like here, but in other states, including in Maryland, in my state. Third thing is we have to recognize that this is not solely a healthcare crisis. I have one of my closest friends from time in government, full admiral, vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, highly decorated Air Force, Navy pilot, lost his 19-year-old son 1 year and 2 months ago in his first week of college. And as he says, if this can happen to him and to his son, John, it can happen to anyone, including my 3 kids. So we have to recognize that this is a societal challenge for all of us. And things like stigma for treatment, things like the words that we use around substance abuse disorder, things like how we view kids self-medicating because of the experiences they're having in middle schools and high schools. These are all parts of a comprehensive response that without, we're not going to get There won't be a healthcare system big enough for us to address this if we don't address the epidemic holistically. Like, by the way, the HIV crisis, right? I don't love the comparison with the Reagan administration on the opioid crisis for the Obama team. But what a remarkable bit of public and healthcare and health policy in the last 15, 20 years on HIV. We need the same kind of activity on opioids.
Sure, go ahead.
Hello, I was wondering, not including Syria, in terms of policy, what was Obama's single largest mistake and how should he have handled the situation better?
Excellent question. He's answered this question. I'm going to answer it for him and then for me. He's answered this question by saying Libya and the aftermath of the demise of Muammar Gaddafi is his biggest mistake. And what he says is that we over-trusted the French and the British willingness and, importantly, capability to manage the day after the military exercise, military effort. Which is to say that he had an extended back and forth with President Sarkozy and Prime Minister Cameron. I remember witnessing these conversations where he said, okay, you guys got to understand, as we've learned in Iraq, the ending the violence is the initial violence is the easy part. The hard part is reconstruction afterwards. And we can't do this unless you guys are in the lead. And that didn't work. And he faults himself for that. And I hasten to add that I don't think we have the Syria decisions we have absent this Libya experience. So I think that Libya experience really then colors what happens in Syria. One. Two, for me, the biggest the biggest mistake I made was not trying healthcare.gov myself before October 1st. I remember I went to New York the week before October 1st to sit down with all the news anchors to talk them through the new healthcare website. Except I had printouts. I was coming home on the plane thinking, I wonder if I should have just had a laptop. Wow. So etched in my mind's eye is that little hourglass stuck there. And I will see that until my dying day.
So one last question from the audience, and then I have one to wrap up, and please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Noelia, and my question was, you mentioned the impact of Anita Hill's statement. Given that appointing a Supreme Court justice is one of the most significant long-term decisions an administration can make, do you believe the history will shift in the case of Kavanaugh's accuser?
We had a short discussion about this in class earlier today. And I think the most important, I think there are two really important attributes for a leader or for a policymaker. One is curiosity, and one is hunger. And if I could hire for hunger, I would hire for hunger every time. We have insufficient monikers for hunger in our current lexicon, right? Like you guys as Bowdoin graduates, supremely curious and capable people are hungry people. So Bowdoin is one moniker for hunger. If I'm the chief of staff of the White House right now, I want to know, I'm curious to know whether the charge is true. And there's ways for me to try to find out if it's true. The way traditionally we find that out is what's called an FBI background check. You don't do background checks because you believe there is a criminal crime that has been committed. You do it because you just want to find out if there's something in this person's background that makes him or her unsuitable for the position, unworthy of the trust for the position, potentially susceptible to blackmail in the position. And so it surprises me that nobody in the White House wants to know the answer to this question. And as a general matter, I think the reasons why curiosity and hunger are so important is because you don't know what's going to happen. And you want to exhaust remedy. Something that the lawyers used to say a lot in the White House. We want to exhaust remedy on this, which is you just want to try everything before we settle on the fact that our belief is best. That's why I should have tried healthcare.gov. Right? I should have been curious enough to try healthcare.gov. And I think they owe it to the country to have the FBI take a look. And absent that, I think they're set aside the moral questions, the fairness questions. I think they have to wonder in the back of their mind forevermore, because it's a lifetime appointment, whether it does turn, as your question suggests. So I think a good policymaker would recognize that your question exists, in which case they should exhaust remedy. And it's inexplicable to me that they're choosing not to. Again, setting aside the moral questions, which are significant. That's what strikes me here. And so the answer to your question is, it may. In as much as it may, I think they owe the country exhaustion of remedy to find out if it's true.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to end by pulling back a little bit. We've had so many amazing questions asked. And in an op-ed in the Washington Post, you wrote, "When the United States steps back from its commitments, other countries do the same." I think you could argue that the US has stepped back from several commitments made to the globe over the last year and a half. So what does that decision do to the United States? How does it change the world order? You said we're watching things change faster than you've ever seen before. Or to put it another way, is America's influence now shrinking around the globe? And if so, what is the new world order going to look like?
Fascinating question. I'm a little bit older than you are, but my professional experience has been shaped by the events, especially as a national security person. It's been shaped by the events of 1989 to 1991, fall of the Soviet Union, and the triumph of the United States in the Cold War. And I think your all's professional experience will be shaped in many of the same ways by the rise of China. And, you know, we used to talk a lot, and President Obama and President Xi would talk a lot about the Thucydides trap, which is the rise of one power as against the status quo power. And must that rise result in conflict? 14, 16 times that's happened in world history, and overwhelmingly, most recently when the United States surpassed the Brits as a world power, overwhelmingly in those instances, conflict has resulted. So I think that's the defining question of the world order. And one of the things that we bring to this competition with a rising China are things like allies, We have an alliance system unlike any in the history of the world. Moral suasion. President Obama used to say, when Ebola breaks out, people don't call Beijing. They call Washington. Although, importantly, China did do its part on the Ebola crisis by sending doctors and supplies for the first time to a global crisis like that. And so when, for example, like earlier this week, the quote you took was from an op-ed I wrote about refugees. Earlier this week, we announced that we'll resettle only 30,000 refugees this coming year in the United States. The average over the life of the program, which goes back to 1980, is about 80,000 a year. The height was about 300,000 a year under the Reagan administration. And we're down to a tenth of that. And when we're in this global competition and we're sacrificing some of the intangibles of our strength, I think that's a mistake. Because I think it suggests to our friends who have bet and have come with us, even in the context of another rising power, it leaves them with the impression that perhaps what we were is changing, in which case maybe they should start to relook their historic commitment to us and to our alliances. And so that's what I see as the challenge. And, President Obama also used to say a lot, especially to students, and he says one other thing, which I'll close with, but if I could choose to be born anywhere at any time, it'd be here and now in the United States. And remarkably, in his last speech, Dr. King said the same thing when he was in Memphis. And that suggests that we have a lot going for us. So we shouldn't squander it. Nevertheless, I feel, with those attributes going for us, I like our odds, but we shouldn't make it any harder. The other thing President Obama tells students in particular, since he's experiencing this and I'm about to experience it myself, which is, he says, your parents miss you. They cry when you're not there. So when you go home tonight, make sure you text your parents to tell them that you miss them too. And I guarantee you it will be a well-received text.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I want to again thank the faculty, the greater Bowdoin community who turned out, and of course, especially thank all of the students who came, who paid close attention, and who asked fantastic questions. So I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Fun. Thanks.
So this concludes this evening's discussion, and on behalf of the Bowdoin Public Service Initiative and the entire Bowdoin community, we'd like to thank you both for an amazing conversation and for reminding us of our collective responsibility to serve the common good. We'd like to present you both with small gifts from the entire Bowdoin community.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mom. Very nice. Thank you. Awesome.
Enjoy your evening, and thank you again.
Thanks, Mo. Thank you.